Tonight, we travel back into the world's most forgotten history. Close your eyes, relax, and drift into history. Welcome to another quiet journey through the past. Tonight, our story begins in a place where the first light of dawn touched pale stone walls, where river mist floated over calm water, and where the sounds of ordinary work quietly filled the air long before the day became warm. This is the story of a job that almost no one remembers. Not the work of a king. Not the work of a great builder. Not the work of a soldier or a famous scribe. Instead, it is the quiet job of feeding sacred temple geese. Far from the noise of marketplaces and distant royal courts, there were people whose days passed in gentle routines. They rose before sunrise. They swept dusty paths. They carried baskets. They cared for animals that belonged not to themselves, but to the temples of the gods. Their names have mostly disappeared into time. Yet for many years, their work continued with steady patience beneath the warm Egyptian sun. And tonight, we will walk beside them. We will move slowly through temple courtyards. We will listen to the rustle of feathers. We will feel the cool morning air before the heat arrives. And little by little, we will discover what life may have felt like for a person whose daily responsibility was to care for sacred geese in ancient Egypt. So settle comfortably. Let the ancient world unfold around you. And drift softly into the quiet rhythms of the Nile. Part 1. Before the first rays of sunlight reached the tops of the temple walls, the keeper of the geese was already awake. The world around him remained mostly dark. A few stars still lingered overhead. The moon hung low above the distant fields. Inside a small mud-brick house near the edge of a settlement, he slowly opened his eyes after a night of light sleep. The air felt cool for a brief moment. That coolness would not last long. Soon the sun would rise above the eastern horizon, and the familiar heat of Egypt would settle across the land once again. But for now, the world was peaceful. The keeper sat quietly for a moment on a woven reed mat. His joints felt stiff from yesterday's work. His shoulders carried a familiar heaviness. Years of lifting baskets, carrying grain, hauling water, and walking long distances had left their marks on his body. Nothing felt unusual. This was simply how mornings felt. Outside, the village remained mostly silent. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A donkey shifted beside a nearby wall. From another house came the faint sound of someone grinding grain before dawn. Life was already beginning. The keeper stood and stretched slowly. His simple linen clothing hung nearby. The fabric was worn but clean. He slipped on his sandals and stepped outside. The sky had begun to change. Deep blue slowly softened into pale shades of gray. A thin line of light appeared beyond the horizon. Nearby homes stood quietly beneath the fading stars. Mud-brick walls reflected the first hints of morning. Palm trees stood motionless in the still air. The keeper began his walk toward the temple. The road beneath his sandals felt firm and familiar. He had traveled this path thousands of times. Every curve, every stone, every small patch of packed earth. He knew them all. As he walked, the smell of baking bread drifted from several homes. Women had already begun preparing food for the day. Small clay ovens glowed with warmth. Thin streams of smoke rose gently into the brightening sky. The keeper breathed deeply. Bread would come later. First there was work. Ahead, the temple slowly emerged from the darkness. Its walls appeared massive compared to the small houses nearby. Tall stone columns stood in silent rows. Painted surfaces glowed faintly in the growing light. Even from a distance, the building seemed calm and timeless. The temple belonged to the gods. Everything inside followed careful routines. Every offering, every prayer, every task. And among those tasks was the care of sacred animals. Some temples housed cats. Others cared for ibises. Some kept cattle. And some maintained flocks of geese whose presence held religious meaning. The keeper approached a side entrance used by workers. Other laborers arrived as well. A water carrier balanced jars across his shoulders. A sweeper carried bundles of reeds. Several young workers yawned quietly as they entered the complex. No one spoke much. Morning energy came slowly. Inside the temple grounds, the world felt different. The air seemed cooler within the shadow of the high walls. Stone pathways crossed open courtyards. Gardens occupied sheltered spaces where trees and flowering plants received precious water. Birdsong echoed softly through the stillness. The keeper made his way toward the animal enclosures. Here the sacred geese spent their nights. As he approached, he could already hear them. Soft honks. Gentle rustling. The sound of feathers brushing together. The birds had awakened. Many stood waiting near wooden gates. Others wandered through enclosed yards. A few still rested with their heads tucked beneath their wings. The keeper paused. For a moment, he simply observed them. Morning inspections mattered. He checked for injuries. He watched for unusual behavior. He noticed whether any birds appeared weak or sick. The health of the flock reflected the quality of his work. Temple officials expected careful attention. The geese were valuable. Not merely as animals, but as living creatures connected to sacred traditions. The keeper unlatched the gate. Immediately several birds waddled toward him. They recognized his presence. They knew what came next. Food. The first feeding of the day required preparation. Storage rooms nearby held supplies gathered from temple lands. Farmers working temple fields produced grain throughout the year. Some of that grain eventually found its way here. The keeper entered a cool storage chamber. Clay jars lined the walls. Baskets rested neatly on raised platforms. The smell of grain filled the air. It was earthy and comforting. Using a woven scoop, he began filling several baskets. The work was repetitive. Scoop. Lift. Pour. Again and again. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning light. The keeper worked patiently. There was no reason to rush. The geese would eat. The day would continue. Everything moved according to established rhythm. When the baskets were ready, he carried them outside. The birds immediately grew more active. A chorus of excited sounds filled the enclosure. Wings fluttered. Necks stretched forward. Feet shuffled across the ground. The keeper scattered grain carefully. He moved from one area to another to ensure all birds received food. Some geese rushed forward eagerly. Others remained calm. The oldest birds often seemed in no hurry. Experience had taught them that food would always arrive. As the flock ate, sunlight finally reached the enclosure. Golden light spilled across feathers. White plumage seemed almost to glow. Long shadows stretched across the ground. The day had officially begun. Nearby, other temple workers attended to their own duties. Gardeners watered plants. Sweepers cleared dust from pathways. Priests prepared for morning rituals. The entire complex gradually came alive. Yet despite all this activity, a feeling of calm remained. Work happened steadily. Without urgency. Without noise. Each person knew their role. Each person followed familiar routines. For the keeper, the geese remained the center of everything. Their feeding was only the beginning. Fresh water required attention next. Large containers needed cleaning and refilling. Water had to remain suitable for the birds. Dirty water encouraged illness. Healthy birds depended upon constant care. The keeper lifted heavy jars and carried them repeatedly. His muscles warmed with effort. Sweat soon appeared across his forehead. The coolness of dawn faded. The heat of Egypt quietly returned. Above, the sky had become brilliantly blue. Clouds were rare. Sunlight grew stronger with every passing hour. The geese wandered through their enclosure after feeding. Some searched the ground for leftover grains. Others moved toward shaded areas. Several approached water basins. The keeper watched them closely. Observation formed a large part of his work. A healthy flock behaved in familiar ways. Changes often signaled problems. And problems required quick attention. The temple depended upon reliability. So did the birds. By mid-morning, activity across the temple reached its usual pace. Visitors arrived carrying offerings. Merchants passed along nearby roads. Workers transported supplies. The scent of incense drifted from sacred chambers. Somewhere within the temple, prayers were being spoken softly. Yet here among the geese, life followed a simpler rhythm. Feeding. Cleaning. Watching. Walking. Repeating. The keeper spent much of his time moving slowly through the enclosure. His sandals brushed against dusty ground. Occasionally he paused beneath shade. Sometimes he repaired fencing. Sometimes he removed debris. Sometimes he simply stood quietly while the birds moved around him. Hours passed in this way. The work rarely changed. Day after day. Season after season. Year after year. And perhaps that sameness carried a certain comfort. The Nile flowed according to its cycle. Fields followed their seasons. The temple followed its rituals. The geese followed their habits. The keeper followed his responsibilities. Everything belonged to a larger pattern. By late morning, the heat had become intense. Stone surfaces reflected sunlight. The air shimmered above distant walls. Many workers slowed their pace. Shade became precious. The keeper sat briefly beneath a tree near the enclosure. A simple meal waited inside a small cloth bundle. Bread. A few vegetables. Perhaps some dried fish. Nothing elaborate. Just enough to restore energy. He ate slowly while listening to the sounds around him. Birds called softly. Leaves rustled. Footsteps echoed from nearby courtyards. Somewhere beyond the walls, a donkey brayed. The world felt busy and peaceful at the same time. After eating, work resumed. There was always something requiring attention. A damaged gate. An empty water basin. A bird needing examination. No task seemed important enough to become famous. No record would celebrate these daily efforts. Yet the temple depended on countless workers exactly like him. Without them, sacred routines could not continue. Without them, the grand stone buildings would become empty shells. The keeper likely understood this in a simple way. Not as philosophy. Not as grand reflection. Just as ordinary truth. His work mattered because it needed to be done. And so, beneath the bright Egyptian sun, among feathers and grain and dust, another day continued quietly forward. The sacred geese wandered through their enclosure. The temple carried on with its ancient routines. And the keeper remained at his post, moving steadily through the hours, as generations of workers had done before him. The afternoon still stretched ahead, carrying with it more heat, more labor, and more of the gentle routines that shaped life along the Nile thousands of years ago. The afternoon settled over the temple like a warm blanket of sunlight. By this hour, shadows had shortened beneath the feet of workers. The bright sky stretched endlessly overhead, and the air seemed almost still. Even the birds moved more slowly beneath the weight of the day's heat. The keeper of the sacred geese stood near a shaded wall and watched the flock. This was often the quietest part of the day. The rush of morning duties had passed. The evening tasks had not yet arrived. For a little while, everything seemed to drift at a slower pace. The geese rested wherever they could find comfort. Some gathered beneath wooden shelters built beside the enclosure. Others sat near water basins where cooler air lingered. A few tucked their heads beneath their wings and slept. The keeper understood these patterns well. After years of caring for the flock, he could almost predict where each bird would spend the hottest hours. He moved carefully among them. The ground beneath his sandals was warm. Dust clung lightly to his feet. The smell of sun-heated earth filled the enclosure. Nearby, insects hummed softly among patches of grass. Nothing hurried. Nothing demanded excitement. The entire temple seemed to breathe slowly beneath the afternoon sun. Beyond the enclosure walls, workers continued their own routines. Stonecutters repaired damaged surfaces. Gardeners carried water from storage jars. Young apprentices hurried between buildings with messages and supplies. The sounds reached the keeper only faintly. Most of what he heard came from the birds. A quiet honk. The rustle of feathers. The gentle splash of water. Simple sounds repeated throughout the day. Simple sounds repeated throughout the years. The keeper approached one of the water basins. The level had dropped slightly. Several geese stood nearby drinking. He lifted a clay jar and poured fresh water into the basin. The sound of flowing water seemed especially pleasant in the heat. For a moment he watched the surface ripple. Tiny reflections of sunlight danced across the water. The geese moved closer. One bird dipped its beak. Another shook droplets from its feathers. The keeper smiled faintly. Not every moment of labor felt difficult. Some moments carried a quiet satisfaction. The flock appeared healthy. The birds were calm. The day's work was proceeding as it should. In ancient Egypt, temple animals often occupied an unusual place in daily life. They were creatures of the earth like any others. They needed food. They needed water. They became ill. They grew old. Yet they also carried symbolic importance. They existed within sacred spaces. Their care formed part of larger traditions that stretched back through generations. The keeper may not have spent much time thinking about these larger meanings. Most workers rarely had leisure for philosophical reflection. Their days were full. Their responsibilities remained constant. But perhaps now and then, during quiet afternoons like this one, he felt some small sense of pride. The geese belonged to the temple. And he was trusted with their care. Trust mattered. Especially in a world where many laborers worked under constant supervision. A trusted worker gained stability. A trusted worker gained respect. Not great wealth. Not fame. But something valuable nonetheless. The sun climbed higher. The heat deepened. Many birds drifted into sleep. The keeper himself felt tired. His eyelids grew heavy. His shoulders ached. The previous night had been short. Like most working people in Egypt, he rose before dawn and often remained active until darkness returned. Rest came in small pieces throughout the day, whenever shade and opportunity allowed. Near the enclosure stood a simple shelter made from wooden posts and woven reeds. The keeper stepped inside. The shade felt pleasant. A light breeze moved through the gaps. For a few moments he sat quietly. His back rested against a mud-brick wall. Outside, the geese continued their slow afternoon routines. The sounds of the temple seemed distant. His breathing became steady. His thoughts wandered. Perhaps he thought about home. Perhaps about his family. Perhaps about the evening meal waiting after work. Or perhaps he thought about nothing at all. Many laborers lived with a kind of practical exhaustion. When work paused, the mind often welcomed stillness. The keeper closed his eyes briefly. Not fully asleep. Not fully awake. Simply resting. Nearby, a goose called softly. The sound echoed through the warm air. A few moments later another answered. Then silence returned. Time passed slowly. Ancient Egypt often feels distant when viewed through surviving monuments and inscriptions. Yet for ordinary people, life moved much as life always does. Days were measured not by famous events but by familiar routines. Preparing food. Carrying water. Repairing tools. Caring for animals. Watching children grow. Waiting for cooler evening air. Most people experienced history through daily labor rather than grand moments. The keeper's afternoon reflected that reality perfectly. His world consisted largely of tasks repeated thousands of times. There was comfort in repetition. There was stability in knowing what tomorrow would bring. The sacred geese would need feeding. The water basins would require cleaning. The fences would need inspection. The same duties would return with the next sunrise. Eventually the keeper rose from his resting place. The afternoon still had many hours remaining. He walked slowly around the enclosure. The birds stirred as he approached. Several stood and stretched their wings. Others resumed searching the ground for bits of grain. A young goose wandered near a section of fencing. The keeper examined the area. One wooden support had loosened slightly. Nothing serious. But it would need repair. Temple work often involved small maintenance tasks. Waiting too long allowed small problems to become larger ones. The keeper retrieved tools from a nearby storage room. The room smelled faintly of wood, rope, and dry reeds. Inside rested simple items used throughout the enclosure. Baskets. Repair materials. Extra containers. Bundles of straw. Nothing luxurious. Just practical objects supporting daily work. He carried a length of rope back to the fence. The repair required patience rather than strength. Slowly he tightened the support. Pulled the rope. Checked the stability. Adjusted it again. The sun continued its journey overhead. The afternoon drifted onward. Beyond the temple walls, life across the Nile Valley followed similar rhythms. Farmers worked fields where grain swayed gently in the breeze. Fishermen guided boats through calm stretches of water. Women prepared food inside shaded homes. Children carried small tasks assigned by their families. Merchants traveled dusty roads between settlements. Everywhere people labored beneath the same sun. Everywhere people awaited the relief of evening. The keeper occasionally glanced toward the distant river. Though partially hidden by buildings and trees, the Nile remained present in almost every aspect of Egyptian life. Its waters nourished crops. Its floods shaped seasons. Its boats carried goods and travelers. Its presence connected villages, temples, and cities. Even the grain fed to the sacred geese ultimately depended upon the river. Without the Nile, little of this world could exist. The keeper understood this not through written lessons but through experience. Everyone did. The river influenced every harvest, every meal, every year. As the afternoon slowly advanced, shadows began to lengthen once again. The most intense heat gradually softened. A faint breeze stirred across the temple grounds. Workers moved with slightly more energy. The approach of evening could be felt long before the sun actually began to set. The geese sensed it too. Activity within the enclosure increased. Birds rose from resting places. Small groups wandered through open spaces. Calls became more frequent. Feathers flashed white beneath the sunlight. The keeper prepared for another feeding. This meal would help sustain the flock through the evening and night. Once again he visited the storage rooms. The familiar scent of grain greeted him. Dust floated lazily through shafts of sunlight. He filled baskets carefully. Each movement felt practiced. Each action flowed naturally into the next. Years of repetition had transformed labor into rhythm. The baskets felt heavy against his arms. Yet the weight no longer surprised him. His body knew this work. His muscles anticipated it. Outside, the geese immediately noticed his return. The enclosure came alive with expectation. Birds gathered near feeding areas. Necks stretched forward. Feet shuffled eagerly. The keeper smiled again. Some things never changed. Food remained important no matter how sacred the animal. He scattered grain slowly across several sections of the enclosure. The geese moved toward it in waves. Soft sounds filled the air. Feathers brushed together. Beaks tapped against the ground. The evening meal had begun. Nearby, the temple entered a different phase of activity. The busiest hours were ending. Visitors gradually departed. Work crews completed final tasks. Long shadows stretched across courtyards and pathways. The golden light of late afternoon touched stone columns and painted walls. Everything appeared softer, calmer, almost dreamlike. The keeper watched the flock eat. The day's responsibilities were nearing completion. Soon the geese would settle for the night. Soon workers would begin their journeys home. Soon cooking fires would glow throughout nearby settlements. The evening carried its own familiar comforts. After a long day beneath the Egyptian sun, even simple moments felt rewarding. A meal. A place to sit. The company of family. The cooler air that arrived after sunset. These small pleasures mattered deeply. The keeper knew them well. For now, however, he remained among the geese. The birds finished eating gradually. Some wandered toward water. Others began searching for preferred resting spots. The enclosure grew quieter. The light continued to soften. Above, the sky shifted almost imperceptibly toward evening. Another day in the temple was slowly drawing toward night. And the keeper, surrounded by feathers, dust, fading sunlight, and the gentle sounds of sacred geese, continued his quiet work exactly as countless ordinary workers had done throughout the long centuries of ancient Egypt. The light of late afternoon slowly turned golden across the temple grounds. Stone walls that had appeared bright and white beneath the midday sun now glowed with softer colors. Long shadows stretched across pathways. The air remained warm, but the sharp edge of the day's heat had begun to fade. For the keeper of the sacred geese, this was often the most pleasant time of day. The hardest labor was nearly finished. The enclosure had been cleaned. The water had been refreshed. The birds had received their evening feeding. Now the flock settled gradually into the slower rhythm that came before nightfall. The keeper walked quietly among them. His pace matched the calm mood of the evening. The geese moved in small groups across the enclosure. Some wandered near the water basins. Others rested beneath shelters built from reeds and wood. A few carefully groomed their feathers, passing their beaks through each layer with patient attention. The keeper watched them closely. Healthy birds spent time caring for their feathers. It was one of many small signs he had learned to notice over the years. A person unfamiliar with the flock might see only a gathering of birds. The keeper saw much more. He noticed which goose preferred shade. He recognized which birds stayed close together. He knew which older geese moved more slowly than the others. He understood the habits of the flock in the same way a farmer understands his fields or a fisherman understands the river. Knowledge arrived slowly. One day at a time. One season at a time. One year after another. Above the enclosure, several birds crossed the evening sky. Their dark shapes drifted against the fading blue. The keeper paused to watch them. Many birds traveled freely across Egypt. They followed the river. They followed changing seasons. They rested among marshes and reeds. The sacred geese, however, remained within the protection of the temple. Their world was smaller. Their lives followed different patterns. Yet they too belonged to the great landscape of the Nile Valley. Everything seemed connected in quiet ways. The river, the fields, the temples, the villages, the birds, the people. The same evening sunlight touched them all. As the sun lowered further, activity increased outside the temple. Workers began preparing for the journey home. The sounds of conversation drifted through nearby courtyards. Footsteps echoed across stone floors. Wooden doors opened and closed. The temple had its own daily rhythm just as surely as the geese did. Every morning it awakened. Every evening it slowly settled toward rest. The keeper carried an empty basket toward one of the storage rooms. Inside, the air felt pleasantly cool after hours spent outdoors. Thick stone walls blocked much of the heat. The room smelled of grain, dry reeds, and dust. Large clay jars stood neatly arranged along the walls. The keeper checked supplies carefully. This task occurred nearly every evening. He needed to know how much grain remained. Deliveries from temple fields arrived regularly, but careful records helped prevent shortages. Nearby, scribes often kept written accounts. They tracked harvests. They counted livestock. They recorded deliveries. Ancient Egypt depended heavily upon record keeping. The great temples managed large amounts of land, food, and labor. Yet while scribes worked with brushes and papyrus, the keeper worked with baskets and grain. Different jobs. Different skills. Both necessary. The keeper finished his inspection and stepped back outside. The evening air felt cooler now. A faint breeze stirred dust across the ground. Palm leaves rustled softly overhead. The geese seemed more active again as the temperature dropped. Several wandered near the enclosure gates. Others explored corners they had ignored during the hottest hours. The keeper smiled faintly. The birds often behaved this way. The cooler air brought renewed energy. It was a welcome relief after the long afternoon. Across the temple complex, lamps were beginning to appear. Small flames flickered inside doorways. Workers prepared torches for areas that would remain active after sunset. The growing darkness changed the appearance of everything. Familiar spaces became softer. Edges blurred. Colors faded. The temple seemed quieter with every passing moment. The keeper moved toward a section of the enclosure where younger geese often gathered. These birds required extra attention. Youth brought energy. It also brought occasional trouble. Young birds squeezed through openings. They wandered into places they should avoid. They sometimes challenged one another in noisy displays. The keeper checked the fencing carefully. Everything appeared secure. He adjusted a few loose reeds and continued walking. Nearby, a group of geese rested beside a shallow pool. The surface reflected the evening sky. Soft ripples moved across the water. The reflection of a temple wall shimmered gently. For a few moments, the keeper simply stood and watched. There was no immediate task demanding his attention. No basket requiring transport. No repair requiring tools. Only stillness. Only the fading light. Such moments were rare enough to appreciate. Most working people in ancient Egypt lived busy lives. Every day involved effort. Every day demanded energy. Yet small pauses appeared here and there. A few quiet breaths beneath a tree. A short rest beside water. A peaceful evening glance across a familiar landscape. Simple moments often carried surprising comfort. As sunset approached, the western horizon glowed with rich colors. Gold deepened into orange. Orange softened into red. The river beyond the temple reflected streaks of light. Boats traveling along the Nile became dark silhouettes against the bright water. The keeper could see some of them from higher points within the temple grounds. Fishing boats headed toward shore. Transport vessels completed their final journeys of the day. The river itself seemed calmer in the evening. Its waters flowed steadily beneath the changing sky. Generations had watched these same sunsets. Farmers, builders, servants, priests, children, merchants, people whose names were forgotten long ago. Yet they all knew this evening light. They all felt the relief that arrived when the heat finally eased. The keeper certainly felt it. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing slowed. The day's labor rested heavily in his muscles. There would be work again tomorrow. There was always work tomorrow. But for now, the hardest part of the day was ending. One by one, temple workers began leaving. Some walked together. Others traveled alone. Many followed dusty roads toward nearby villages. The keeper knew several of them well. Years of shared labor created quiet friendships. People learned each other's routines. They exchanged brief greetings. They shared simple conversations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing grand. Just the ordinary companionship of people who worked side by side. The keeper still had a few duties remaining. Nightfall required a final inspection. The sacred geese needed to be safely settled before he departed. He moved slowly through the enclosure once more. The birds had begun choosing resting places. Many gathered near familiar shelters. Others nestled together in small groups. Soft sounds drifted through the evening air. The flock gradually became quieter. The keeper checked water levels. He examined gates. He inspected fencing one final time. Everything appeared satisfactory. The enclosure was secure. The birds were calm. The day's responsibilities had been completed successfully. A deep sense of routine settled over the scene. Not pride exactly. Not excitement. Something gentler. The quiet satisfaction that comes from finishing necessary work. The kind of feeling familiar to workers in every age. Nearby, temple lamps glowed more brightly as darkness increased. Their light reflected softly against stone surfaces. Small insects circled the flames. The scent of oil and smoke drifted through the air. Above, the first stars began appearing. Ancient Egypt possessed remarkably clear night skies. Without modern lights, the heavens seemed vast. Countless stars stretched across the darkness. Constellations rose above the river. The moon often cast pale silver light across fields and temple walls. Many workers spent their lives beneath these skies. The keeper was no exception. As he looked upward, familiar patterns emerged among the stars. He had seen them thousands of times. As a child. As a young worker. As an older man carrying out the same duties year after year. The sky remained constant while lives slowly changed beneath it. Night deepened further. The geese settled almost completely. Most stood quietly. Some slept. The enclosure grew peaceful. Only occasional sounds disturbed the silence. A soft rustle. A distant call. The faint splash of water. The keeper lingered a little longer. Partly from responsibility. Partly because the evening was beautiful. The day's noise had faded. The temple seemed wrapped in calm. The river flowed unseen beyond the darkness. A cool breeze drifted through the palms. For a few moments, everything felt still. Eventually, the keeper turned toward the gate. His workday had ended. The sacred geese were safe. The temple would remain peaceful through the night. Tomorrow morning, before sunrise, he would return once again. The same path. The same gates. The same flock. The same quiet duties. And so he stepped beyond the enclosure and began walking through the darkening temple grounds, while behind him the sacred geese rested beneath the stars, surrounded by silence, stone, and the gentle breath of the ancient Egyptian night. The keeper walked slowly through the temple grounds while darkness gathered across the Nile Valley. Behind him, the sacred geese rested quietly within their enclosure. Ahead of him lay the familiar path home. The day's heat had finally loosened its grip upon the land. A cooler breeze drifted through the courtyards, carrying faint scents of water, reeds, dust, and distant cooking fires. Temple lamps flickered beside stone walls. Their small flames created pools of warm light surrounded by deep shadow. Workers who had remained late moved quietly through the darkness. A priest crossed a courtyard carrying an oil lamp. Two laborers secured a storage room door. A gardener finished watering plants that would rest through the night. The great temple was never entirely asleep. Some tasks continued long after sunset. Yet compared to the busy hours of daylight, the complex now seemed almost silent. The keeper passed beneath a row of tall columns. Their massive shapes disappeared upward into darkness. The painted figures carved into the stone appeared softer in the dim light. By day they stood bright and clear. By night they seemed to drift like old memories across the walls. The keeper rarely stopped to study them. Like many workers, he passed these images every day. They had become part of the landscape of his life. Familiar. Constant. Always present. He reached the outer gate and stepped onto the dusty road leading toward the village. The sky overhead had become a field of stars. Thousands of tiny lights stretched across the darkness. The moon had risen higher now. Its pale glow rested upon the earth. Mud-brick houses reflected soft silver light. Palm trees cast long shadows across open ground. Far away, a dog barked. The sound carried easily through the cool night air. The keeper adjusted the small cloth bag hanging from his shoulder and continued walking. His feet knew the path without effort. Years of repetition had made every turn familiar. The road curved gently past cultivated fields. Even at night, the scent of growing crops lingered in the air. Grain fields rested beneath moonlight. Vegetable gardens stood quiet behind low walls. Somewhere nearby, irrigation channels carried water drawn from the Nile. The river itself could not be seen clearly from here. Yet its presence remained unmistakable. A faint smell of wet earth drifted through the darkness. The keeper listened to the sounds of evening. Crickets chirped among grasses. Palm fronds rustled overhead. Occasionally a distant voice floated from another road. Nothing felt hurried. Nothing demanded attention. The world seemed content to rest. As he approached the village, signs of family life appeared around him. Warm light glowed through doorways. Cooking fires still burned in small courtyards. People sat together after the long day. Some prepared meals. Others repaired tools. Children who had not yet fallen asleep whispered softly beneath the stars. Life moved at a gentler pace after sunset. The keeper reached his home. The structure was simple. Like most houses in the settlement, it had been built from mud bricks shaped by hand. The walls held warmth gathered during the day. The roof consisted of wooden beams covered with layers of reeds and packed earth. Nothing about the house appeared grand. Yet it provided shelter. And after a long day of labor, shelter mattered greatly. A faint glow came from inside. Someone had lit a small oil lamp. The keeper stepped through the doorway. Immediately he felt a sense of relief. Work belonged to the temple. Home belonged to evening. The two worlds often felt very different. Inside, the air carried familiar scents. Bread. Smoke. Cooked vegetables. The simple aromas of an ordinary household. A clay jar rested near one wall. Woven baskets occupied a corner. Reed mats covered sections of the floor. The room contained only a few possessions. Most working families owned little beyond what they needed. Objects were useful rather than decorative. Every item served a purpose. The keeper sat down carefully. His muscles welcomed the rest. Hours of walking and lifting had left his legs tired. His shoulders ached. His hands felt rough from labor. None of this surprised him. Physical exhaustion accompanied nearly every day of his life. A meal waited nearby. Simple food. Bread baked earlier that day. A few onions. Some beans. Perhaps a small portion of fish obtained from the river. Meals like this sustained countless Egyptian workers across generations. They were not luxurious. They were not rare. They were simply the food of everyday life. The keeper ate slowly. Outside, the village remained awake. Voices drifted through the darkness. Someone laughed softly. A child called out. A donkey shifted nearby. The sounds blended into a gentle evening rhythm. For many people, nighttime offered the only opportunity to pause. The daylight hours belonged to work. The evening belonged to family. The keeper understood this well. As he ate, he allowed himself to relax. The responsibilities of the temple felt distant now. The geese were safe. The gates were secure. The water basins were full. Tomorrow's work could wait until morning. For a few precious hours, there was nothing requiring immediate attention. The oil lamp flickered gently. Its light danced across the walls. Small shadows shifted and moved. The keeper watched the flame for a while. Ancient nights often felt darker than modern people can easily imagine. Without electric lights, darkness arrived completely. Only fire pushed it away. Only lamps and moonlight illuminated the world after sunset. People adjusted their lives accordingly. Many slept soon after nightfall. Long days of labor left little energy for late evenings. The keeper finished his meal and stepped outside once more. The air felt cooler than before. The village had grown quieter. Many homes had already extinguished their lamps. Above him, the stars seemed brighter than ever. The sky stretched endlessly across the horizon. He could hear the faint sound of insects among nearby plants. Somewhere beyond the fields, a night bird called. The sound rose briefly and then disappeared. Moments like this were easy to overlook. Yet they formed a large part of ordinary life. The famous records of Egypt often describe rulers, temples, and ceremonies. They rarely describe simple evenings beneath the stars. They rarely mention tired workers standing quietly outside their homes. Yet millions of such moments existed. Night after night. Year after year. Generation after generation. The keeper looked toward the distant temple. Even from here, parts of the structure remained visible beneath moonlight. Its silhouette rose above the surrounding landscape. Somewhere within those walls, the sacred geese slept. The birds rested while guards watched gates and priests tended nighttime duties. Soon enough, dawn would return. The geese would awaken. The cycle would begin again. The keeper understood this rhythm completely. His own life followed a similar pattern. Wake before sunrise. Walk to the temple. Feed the flock. Carry water. Repair fences. Return home. Sleep. Repeat. To some people, such a life might appear monotonous. To the keeper, it was simply life itself. Routine brought stability. Routine brought purpose. Routine connected one day to the next. Without it, the world might feel uncertain. The moon climbed higher. A gentle breeze moved through the village. Palm leaves whispered overhead. The keeper eventually returned indoors. The oil lamp burned lower now. Its flame had grown smaller. The room felt peaceful. He spread a sleeping mat across the floor. Nearby rested a simple head support made from wood. Many Egyptians used such supports instead of soft pillows. The keeper lowered himself carefully onto the mat. His body welcomed the chance to rest. The ache in his shoulders seemed heavier now that work had ended. His legs felt pleasantly tired. The day's labor settled over him like a blanket. Outside, the village continued growing quieter. Voices faded. Doors closed. Cooking fires died away. One by one, families drifted toward sleep. The keeper listened to the sounds of the night. The distant call of a bird. The rustle of wind. The occasional bark of a dog. Nothing more. Nothing less. Slowly his eyes grew heavy. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. The stars would fade. The eastern sky would brighten. The geese would be waiting. But for now, the ancient world rested beneath the moon. The temple stood silent beside the river. The fields slept beneath silver light. And the keeper, whose quiet work helped sustain a sacred flock, allowed himself to drift gently toward sleep while the Nile flowed steadily through the darkness beyond. Long before sunrise, while the stars still filled the sky above the Nile Valley, the keeper stirred from sleep. The village remained wrapped in darkness. Most homes were silent. The cooking fires of the previous evening had long since faded into cold ash. Outside, the air carried a coolness that would disappear soon after dawn. For a few brief hours each day, Egypt belonged to the night. The keeper opened his eyes slowly. For a moment he remained still upon his sleeping mat. The room around him was dark except for a faint line of moonlight entering through a small opening in the wall. The familiar sounds of nighttime surrounded him. A distant insect. The rustle of palm leaves. The soft movement of air across the roof. Nothing else. His body felt rested, though not entirely refreshed. Years of labor had taught him that complete comfort was rare. Most workers carried a certain weariness with them. It lived in the muscles. It settled in the joints. It accompanied them through each season. Still, the night had provided enough rest for another day. Slowly he sat up. The darkness felt calm. Unhurried. There was no need to rush. The temple would not awaken all at once. Like the sun itself, activity would arrive gradually. The keeper rose quietly. He slipped on his sandals and stepped outside. The sky above him seemed enormous. Countless stars stretched across the heavens. The moon had moved lower now. Its pale light rested across fields and rooftops. Nearby houses stood silent beneath the fading night. A few dogs wandered narrow paths. A donkey shifted somewhere beyond a wall. The village seemed suspended between yesterday and today. The keeper began walking toward the temple. The road felt familiar beneath his feet. Dust softened his footsteps. Palm trees lined parts of the path. Their dark shapes swayed gently against the stars. As he walked, he noticed the faint scent of river water drifting through the air. The Nile was never far away. Even when unseen, it announced its presence. Its moisture touched the fields. Its scent traveled with the breeze. Its quiet influence shaped every aspect of life. Ahead, the temple stood as a dark silhouette against the horizon. Massive walls rose above the surrounding landscape. Stone towers and columns appeared almost black beneath the remaining night. The building seemed timeless. As though it had stood there forever. As though it would remain forever. Yet even temples depended upon ordinary workers arriving before dawn. Without them, the daily rhythms could not continue. The keeper reached the entrance used by laborers. Several familiar figures were already arriving. A gardener carrying tools. A young assistant balancing empty baskets. A water carrier preparing for the long hours ahead. They exchanged quiet greetings. No one spoke loudly at this hour. The darkness encouraged softness. Together they entered the temple grounds. Inside, the air felt cool and still. The stone beneath their feet retained some of the night's freshness. The keeper made his way toward the geese. Even before reaching the enclosure, he could hear them. Soft movements. Gentle calls. The rustle of feathers. The birds were beginning to awaken. The sound seemed louder in the stillness before dawn. He smiled faintly. Another day was beginning exactly as the previous day had ended. The flock waited. The work waited. The familiar routine unfolded once more. When he reached the enclosure gate, he paused for a moment. The geese rested in small groups. Some still slept. Others stretched their necks and shifted awake. A few wandered quietly through the dim light. The keeper opened the gate and stepped inside. Immediately several birds approached. They recognized him. Not as a friend perhaps. Not in the way humans understand friendship. But as a familiar presence. The person who arrived each morning. The person who brought food. The person whose footsteps appeared with the dawn. The keeper moved carefully through the enclosure. The first task was observation. Every morning began this way. He examined the flock. He watched their movements. He listened to their calls. He looked for anything unusual. Years of experience had taught him what healthy birds should look like. A slight limp, drooping feathers, unusual behavior. Small signs often revealed larger problems. The flock depended upon attention. The temple expected diligence. The keeper provided both. Above the eastern horizon, the first hints of dawn appeared. A thin line of pale light separated earth from sky. The stars nearest the horizon began to fade. Dark blue softened into gray. The transformation happened slowly, almost invisibly. Yet every worker in Egypt knew this moment well. The arrival of dawn marked the true beginning of the day. The keeper left the enclosure briefly and entered the grain storage room. The familiar scent greeted him immediately. Dry grain, dust, clay jars. The room felt cool compared to the open air. He filled several baskets carefully. Each scoop produced a soft sound. Each basket grew heavier. The work required strength but little thought. His hands knew exactly what to do. Years of repetition had made the process effortless. Outside, the sky continued brightening. Birds throughout the temple grounds began to call. Small creatures hidden among trees and gardens welcomed the coming day. The keeper carried the baskets toward the enclosure. The geese became more active immediately. Their calls grew louder. Several birds hurried forward. Others stretched their wings. The anticipation was unmistakable. Food remained important regardless of whether a creature was sacred or ordinary. The keeper scattered grain across the enclosure. The birds moved toward it eagerly. A wave of movement passed through the flock. Feathers brushed together. Feet shuffled across the ground. Soft calls echoed through the morning air. The feeding had begun. As the geese ate, sunlight touched the temple walls. The first golden rays appeared along the highest surfaces. Stone columns glowed softly. Painted carvings emerged from shadow. The temple awakened beneath the rising sun. Across the complex, workers resumed their duties. Sweepers cleared pathways. Gardeners carried water. Temple officials began preparing for the day's activities. The quiet stillness of night gradually gave way to gentle movement. The keeper continued his work among the flock. Once feeding was complete, attention turned to water. Several basins required cleaning. Fresh supplies needed replenishing. The birds depended upon clean water just as much as food. The keeper lifted heavy jars and carried them steadily. Water sloshed against clay sides. The weight pressed against his shoulders. Yet he moved with practiced efficiency. This work had shaped his body over many years. The muscles of his arms and back knew the task well. By now the sun had risen fully. Golden light spread across the landscape. The sky brightened into clear blue. Shadows stretched long across the enclosure. The coolness of dawn lingered for a little while longer. The keeper appreciated these early hours. Soon the heat would arrive. Soon sweat would gather on foreheads. Soon stone walls would radiate warmth. But for now, the morning remained pleasant. A light breeze drifted through the temple grounds. Palm leaves rustled softly overhead. The scent of damp earth rose from recently watered gardens. Nearby, workers exchanged brief conversations while carrying out their duties. The entire complex seemed to awaken gently. Not suddenly. Not noisily. But slowly, like a person opening their eyes after restful sleep. The keeper paused beside a water basin. Several geese drank quietly nearby. The surface reflected the morning sky. Small ripples spread outward from each movement. The scene felt peaceful. Almost timeless. Days changed. Years passed. Generations came and went. Yet mornings like this remained remarkably similar. The river flowed. The sun rose. The birds fed. The workers labored. The cycle continued. For the keeper, these rhythms provided structure. He rarely needed to wonder what tomorrow would bring. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise. Another feeding. Another walk through the enclosure. Another day among the sacred geese. There was comfort in such certainty. As the morning advanced, sunlight strengthened. The cool air gradually warmed. Workers removed extra layers of cloth. Sweat appeared on brows. The familiar heat of Egypt began its slow return. The keeper knew exactly how the day would unfold. The geese would seek shade. Water would require attention. Small repairs would appear. Hours would pass steadily beneath the sun. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unexpected. Just the quiet work that sustained both temple and flock. And so, while the golden light of early morning spread across the Nile Valley, the keeper continued his duties among the sacred geese, moving patiently through another ordinary day in ancient Egypt, surrounded by dust, feathers, sunlight, and the gentle routines that had shaped his life for countless seasons. As the morning continued, the temple slowly filled with the sounds of another ordinary day. Sunlight spilled across the courtyards and climbed the tall stone walls. Shadows that had stretched long and thin after dawn gradually shortened. The air remained pleasant for now, though everyone knew the heat would soon arrive. The keeper of the sacred geese moved through the enclosure with the steady pace that had become second nature. Around him, the flock settled after their morning feeding. Some birds wandered through patches of shade. Others gathered near the water basins. Several younger geese explored the enclosure with endless curiosity, investigating corners and fences as though they had never seen them before. The keeper watched them with patient attention. Young animals often required extra care. They possessed energy but little caution. A loose section of fencing, a damaged gate, or an overturned container might become a problem if left unnoticed. So he walked slowly along the enclosure boundary. His sandals brushed against dusty earth. The morning breeze carried the scent of damp reeds from the nearby river. Above him, a few wild birds crossed the brightening sky. The temple itself had become much busier. Visitors arrived carrying small offerings. Workers transported baskets of grain through shaded corridors. Gardeners trimmed plants growing beside pools and pathways. The sounds of daily labor echoed softly across the complex. Footsteps. Voices. The scrape of tools against stone. The creak of wooden carts. Nothing felt rushed. Even busy days seemed to unfold with a certain calm rhythm. Ancient life often moved according to natural limits. People rose with the sun. They worked through daylight. They rested after dark. Without clocks marking every moment, time flowed differently. The keeper rarely measured his day in hours. Instead, he measured it through tasks. Morning feeding. Water inspection. Fence repairs. Midday meal. Evening feeding. These routines formed the shape of time itself. As the sun climbed higher, warmth spread across the enclosure. The geese responded immediately. Many moved toward shaded areas. A few rested beneath simple shelters built from reeds and wooden poles. The keeper understood these habits well. The birds followed patterns as reliable as the movement of the seasons. He approached a section of fencing near the western side of the enclosure. A wooden support had shifted slightly. Perhaps one of the younger birds had pushed against it. Perhaps wind and time had slowly loosened the structure. Either way, it required attention. The keeper fetched a bundle of reeds and a length of rope from storage. Repair work was a familiar part of his duties. Animals, weather, and constant use gradually wore down even the strongest structures. Nothing remained perfect forever. Everything required maintenance. He knelt beside the fence. The earth felt warm beneath his knees. Patiently he tightened the rope. He adjusted the reeds. He tested the support. Then he adjusted it again. There was no audience. No reward. No recognition. Only the quiet satisfaction of keeping things in good order. Many jobs in ancient Egypt were like this. The work mattered because it prevented problems before they appeared. When a repair was successful, nobody noticed. The fence simply remained standing. The gate simply continued working. The enclosure simply remained secure. The keeper preferred it that way. Quiet success created peaceful days. Nearby, the geese continued their routines. One bird shook its wings, scattering tiny droplets of water into the sunlight. Another stretched its neck and called softly. A small group rested together beneath shade. The sounds blended into a gentle background that accompanied nearly every hour of the keeper's life. By now, the coolness of morning had almost disappeared. The sky remained cloudless. The sunlight grew stronger. Stone surfaces reflected heat. Dusty pathways seemed brighter than before. Workers throughout the temple slowed their pace slightly. The day's most demanding hours were approaching. The keeper carried several clay jars toward the water basins. The jars felt heavy. Water always did. Yet it remained one of the most important resources within the temple. Gardens depended upon it. Animals depended upon it. People depended upon it. Without constant effort, water quickly became scarce. The keeper poured fresh water into the basins. The clear surface shimmered beneath the sunlight. Several geese approached immediately. They drank slowly. Others stepped into the shallow edges and cooled themselves. The keeper paused to watch them. The simple act of drinking water seemed almost peaceful. Perhaps because it reflected something universal. Every living thing required care. Every living thing depended upon the land. The geese depended upon the keeper. The keeper depended upon the temple. The temple depended upon the river. The river depended upon the rhythms of nature that no person could control. The connection stretched outward in every direction. As the morning advanced, a group of workers passed nearby carrying baskets filled with grain. The keeper recognized several faces. Men he had seen for years. People whose routines overlapped with his own. They exchanged brief greetings. A nod. A few quiet words. Then everyone continued working. Friendships often developed this way. Not through long conversations. Not through dramatic events. But through years of shared labor. People became familiar simply by appearing each day. The keeper knew who walked quickly. Who spoke softly. Who arrived before dawn. Who preferred working alone. The temple community formed its own small world. A world built from repetition and routine. The sun climbed higher still. Now the heat could be felt everywhere. The air seemed heavier. The shade beneath trees became precious. Many birds settled into resting places. The geese grew quieter. Even their calls became less frequent. The keeper understood why. During the hottest hours, conserving energy made sense. Animals knew this instinctively. People learned it through experience. Work continued, but movement became slower. Deliberate. Measured. Near the enclosure stood a small tree whose branches spread enough shade for a person to rest beneath. The keeper sat there for a few moments. Not sleeping. Not truly relaxing. Simply pausing. The breeze felt pleasant against his skin. From where he sat, he could see much of the enclosure. The birds rested peacefully. Nothing required immediate attention. Such moments were rare but welcome. His thoughts drifted. Perhaps toward memories of previous years. Perhaps toward family waiting at home. Perhaps toward tomorrow's work. Or perhaps nowhere at all. After many years of routine, the mind sometimes found comfort in simple observation. Watching sunlight move across stone. Watching birds wander through shade. Watching ripples form upon water. No great thoughts were necessary. The world itself provided enough. Nearby, temple gardeners carried water to flowering plants. The scent of damp earth briefly filled the air. Flowers added beauty to the temple grounds, but they required constant care. Just like the geese. Just like the trees. Just like everything else. Nothing flourished without effort. The keeper rose once more and continued his rounds. He checked gates. Inspected shelters. Examined water levels. The familiar sequence repeated itself. Task after task. Step after step. The rhythm never felt hurried. Each responsibility flowed naturally into the next. Above, the sun continued its journey across the sky. The bright morning slowly drifted toward midday. Soon workers would seek shade. Meals would be eaten. The hottest hours would settle over the temple. For now, however, the day remained balanced between morning and noon. The geese rested peacefully. The enclosure remained secure. The keeper moved quietly among the flock, surrounded by sunlight, dust, warm air, and the steady routines that had shaped every season of his working life. And while kings and officials occupied the grand records of history, another ordinary morning unfolded almost unnoticed, carried forward by the patient labor of a man whose world revolved around grain, water, feathers, and the sacred geese entrusted to his care. By the time the sun reached its highest place in the sky, the temple seemed wrapped in a blanket of heat. The bright light fell almost straight downward now. Shadows gathered tightly beneath walls, trees, and shelters. Stone pathways shimmered softly in the distance. Even the air itself appeared to move more slowly. The keeper of the sacred geese felt the change in every part of his body. His shoulders were warm from hours spent outdoors. A thin layer of dust clung to his sandals. Sweat gathered along his forehead and neck. None of this was unusual. For much of the year, midday in Egypt carried a heavy stillness. People adapted their lives to it. Animals adapted their lives to it. Work continued, but at a gentler pace. The geese had settled into their familiar midday habits. Most remained beneath shade. Several rested near water. Others sat quietly with their feathers puffed slightly against the warmth. The lively activity of morning had faded. Now calm ruled the enclosure. The keeper walked among them carefully. His movements were slow and unhurried. There was little reason to rush. The hottest hours demanded patience. He paused beside a water basin. The surface reflected the pale blue sky above. A few floating feathers drifted lazily across the water. Nearby, several geese drank before returning to shaded ground. The keeper examined the basin closely. Clean. Full. Exactly as it should be. These small inspections filled much of his day. They rarely appeared important to anyone watching from a distance. Yet the health of the flock depended upon such attention. A neglected basin. A damaged shelter. A loose gate. Small problems could grow larger if ignored. So the keeper continued his quiet work. One careful observation at a time. One small correction at a time. The temple around him had grown quieter as well. Workers sought shade whenever possible. Many tasks paused until later in the afternoon. Even conversations became less frequent. The heat seemed to encourage silence. Only occasional sounds drifted through the air. The call of a bird. The scrape of a tool. The distant murmur of voices from shaded corridors. Far beyond the temple walls, life along the Nile followed a similar rhythm. Farmers rested briefly beneath palm trees. Boatmen searched for relief beneath woven canopies. Merchants paused in shaded marketplaces. Throughout the valley, people waited patiently for the most intense heat to pass. The keeper found a place beneath a shelter near the enclosure. A wooden post supported the roof above him. The shade felt cool compared to the open sunlight. For a few moments he simply sat. The geese remained nearby. Several rested quietly. Others tucked their heads beneath their wings. The scene felt peaceful. Almost motionless. The keeper looked toward the distant river. Though partly hidden by walls and trees, he could glimpse a narrow strip of shining water. The Nile moved steadily beneath the sunlight. Its surface sparkled brightly. Even from this distance, it seemed alive. The river never truly rested. Day and night it flowed through the heart of Egypt. Its waters nourished crops, filled canals, sustained villages, supported temples, fed animals, provided fish, connected distant communities. Every aspect of life touched the river in some way. The keeper understood this deeply. The grain fed to the sacred geese came from fields nourished by Nile water. The water carried to the basins ultimately came from the same source. Even the reeds used for repairs often grew along riverbanks. The Nile connected everything. A breeze drifted through the enclosure. It carried the scent of wet earth and distant vegetation. For a brief moment, the air felt cooler. Several geese lifted their heads. A few feathers stirred. Then the stillness returned. The keeper closed his eyes briefly. Not sleeping. Simply resting. His breathing slowed. The sounds around him blended together. Birds. Wind. Distant footsteps. The quiet life of the temple. Ancient Egypt often appears in surviving records as a world of monuments and ceremonies. Yet for ordinary workers, life unfolded through countless peaceful moments like this one. A pause beneath shade. A meal shared with family. A walk beside the river. A few quiet breaths during the heat of the day. Such moments rarely entered written records. Yet they filled entire lifetimes. The keeper eventually opened his eyes and stood once more. The day continued. There was always another task waiting. He made his way toward a storage area where extra reeds were kept. The path crossed a small courtyard planted with trees. Their leaves provided welcome shade. Birds perched among the branches. Tiny insects hummed in the warm air. The scent of growing plants lingered pleasantly. The keeper always enjoyed passing through this part of the temple. It felt cooler here. More peaceful. Almost hidden from the larger complex. Inside the storage room, the temperature dropped noticeably. Thick walls protected the interior from the worst of the heat. The room smelled of dried reeds, rope, wood, and dust. Bundles of materials rested neatly along the walls. The keeper gathered what he needed. A few repairs remained unfinished. Nothing urgent. Nothing difficult. Just small maintenance tasks that helped keep the enclosure in good condition. Returning outside, he crossed paths with an elderly gardener. The two men exchanged a brief greeting. They had known each other for years. Perhaps decades. Neither spoke much. Words seemed unnecessary. Familiarity often replaced conversation. Both men understood the nature of temple work. The long hours. The repetition. The quiet satisfaction of keeping things functioning properly. The gardener continued toward the trees. The keeper returned to the geese. The afternoon heat remained strong, though the sun had begun its slow journey downward. The worst of midday would not last forever. Already the light felt slightly different. Almost softer. The keeper repaired a section of shelter where several reeds had loosened. The work required patience more than strength. He adjusted bindings. Secured supports. Checked stability. Then moved on. The geese hardly noticed. They remained focused on rest and comfort. The keeper preferred it that way. A calm flock meant fewer problems. As the afternoon progressed, subtle changes appeared throughout the enclosure. More birds began standing. Some wandered short distances. Others stretched their wings. The heavy stillness of midday slowly loosened. Life began returning to the flock. The keeper noticed these changes immediately. Years of observation had sharpened his awareness. He knew the rhythms of the birds almost as well as he knew his own. Soon evening feeding would approach. The geese seemed to sense it. Perhaps not through thought. Perhaps simply through habit. Either way, their behavior gradually shifted. The day moved forward. Steady. Predictable. Comforting. The sun lowered little by little. Longer shadows appeared beside walls. The air became easier to breathe. Workers throughout the temple resumed tasks that had paused during the hottest hours. Voices grew more common. Footsteps echoed once again across courtyards. The temple seemed to awaken from a brief afternoon rest. The keeper stood beside the enclosure gate and looked across the flock. Hundreds of small details filled his view. White feathers glowing softly in sunlight. Water reflecting the sky. Dust rising beneath moving feet. Shadows stretching across the ground. Everything felt familiar. Everything felt exactly as it should. And so another afternoon in ancient Egypt drifted gently onward, carried by sunlight, routine, patience, and the quiet work of a man whose days were devoted to the care of sacred temple geese beside the timeless waters of the Nile. The afternoon slowly softened into evening. The change came so gradually that it was easy to miss at first. A little less heat in the air. A slightly longer shadow beneath a wall. A gentler quality in the sunlight. The keeper of the sacred geese noticed these things almost without thinking. Years spent outdoors had taught him to read the day as carefully as a scribe read lines of ink upon papyrus. The flock noticed the change as well. Birds that had rested quietly through the hottest hours began to move more frequently. Groups wandered across the enclosure. Several geese approached the water basins. Others searched the ground with renewed interest. The stillness of midday gave way to gentle activity. The keeper walked toward the grain storage rooms. The evening feeding would soon begin. This task had marked the close of countless days. Morning feeding welcomed the day. Evening feeding prepared the flock for night. Together, the two meals formed dependable points within the flow of time. Inside the storage room, the air felt pleasantly cool. Dust floated through beams of golden light entering from a narrow doorway. Clay jars lined the walls. Large baskets rested on raised platforms. The keeper paused briefly. He had stood in this room thousands of times. The sight of grain stored safely for future days always carried a quiet sense of reassurance. Food meant stability. Food meant continuity. Food meant tomorrow would unfold as expected. He lifted a woven scoop and began filling baskets. The grain produced a soft rustling sound. Each basket grew heavier with every scoop. The work felt familiar in the deepest sense. His hands moved without hesitation. His body knew the motions by memory. When the baskets were ready, he carried them toward the enclosure. The geese immediately became alert. A few called loudly. Others hurried forward. Several stretched their necks toward him. The keeper smiled faintly. The response never changed. The birds always knew when food was arriving. Their excitement felt almost comforting. Some things remained reliable year after year. He scattered grain carefully across several areas. The flock spread out naturally. Feathers rustled. Feet shuffled against dusty earth. The enclosure filled with quiet activity. The keeper moved among them, ensuring that food reached all sections of the flock. The sunlight continued to soften. The harsh brightness of midday had disappeared entirely now. Golden light washed across the temple walls. Columns glowed warmly. Painted carvings seemed richer in color. The entire complex appeared calmer beneath the approaching evening. Workers throughout the temple sensed it too. The end of the workday was drawing closer. Tasks were being completed. Tools were being returned to storage. Final inspections were underway. The atmosphere carried a subtle feeling of relief. Not excitement. Not celebration. Simply the quiet satisfaction of seeing another day nearing completion. The keeper finished distributing grain and paused near the enclosure fence. The geese ate peacefully around him. The sounds were gentle. Beaks tapping against the ground. Soft calls. The occasional flutter of wings. Nothing loud. Nothing sudden. Only the familiar sounds that had accompanied much of his life. As he stood there, he noticed a group of visitors crossing a distant courtyard. They moved slowly through the temple, guided by attendants. Some carried offerings. Others simply observed the sacred spaces around them. The keeper rarely paid much attention to visitors. His responsibilities remained with the geese. Still, their presence reminded him of the temple's importance. People traveled from many places. Some came seeking blessings. Some came to honor the gods. Some came because tradition required it. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, ordinary workers kept everything functioning. The visitors saw ceremonies. The workers saw labor. Both formed part of the same world. The feeding continued. As the birds gradually finished their meal, the enclosure grew quieter. Several geese moved toward the water. Others began searching for places where they would eventually rest for the night. The day had begun its final transition. The keeper turned his attention to one last inspection of the grounds. Evening inspections were important. Problems discovered before nightfall could often be corrected immediately. Problems discovered after dark were more difficult. He walked slowly around the perimeter. The fence appeared secure. The shelters remained intact. The water basins were full. Everything seemed in good order. A gentle breeze drifted through the enclosure. The air felt noticeably cooler now. Palm leaves whispered overhead. The scent of nearby gardens floated through the temple grounds. Somewhere beyond the walls, cooking fires were beginning to burn in villages along the river. The smell of smoke mixed with the scent of earth and vegetation. It was a familiar evening fragrance. one known by countless generations of Egyptians. The keeper paused beside a shallow pool near the edge of the enclosure. The water reflected the changing sky. Gold and pale blue shimmered across the surface. A goose stepped carefully into the shallows. Small ripples spread outward. The reflection broke apart and reformed. For a few moments, the keeper simply watched. There was something calming about water, especially at the end of a long day. The Nile itself inspired similar feelings. Its steady presence offered reassurance. The river flowed regardless of human concerns, regardless of seasons, regardless of individual lives. Long before the keeper had been born, the Nile had flowed through Egypt. Long after his lifetime, it would continue. The thought was neither sad nor comforting. It simply felt true. As the sun lowered toward the western horizon, shadows stretched farther across the enclosure. The light became softer with every passing moment. Birds flying overhead turned dark against the bright sky. Temple walls glowed briefly as though illuminated from within. The evening possessed a beauty that arrived daily yet never seemed entirely ordinary. Workers began leaving various parts of the complex. Voices drifted through the courtyards. Doors opened and closed. Sandals brushed against stone pathways. The busy energy of the day slowly faded. The keeper continued his rounds. Several geese had already settled into favored resting areas. Older birds often chose the same places night after night. The keeper knew many of these habits. He could almost predict where individual birds would be found after sunset. Years of observation had created a deep familiarity. The flock felt less like a collection of animals and more like a community with its own patterns and personalities. The sky changed again. The brilliant blue of afternoon gradually deepened. Hints of orange appeared along the horizon. The first signs of sunset had arrived. The keeper stood quietly near the enclosure gate. The geese moved calmly around him. The temple seemed to exhale after the long day. Even the air felt different. Lighter. Cooler. Easier to breathe. For workers who spent their lives beneath the Egyptian sun, evening often brought the greatest comfort. The body relaxed. The mind slowed. The hardest labor had ended. Ahead lay food, rest, and the company of family. Simple rewards, yet deeply appreciated. The keeper thought briefly of home. Of bread waiting on a reed mat. Of the cool night air beyond the temple walls. Of the stars that would soon appear above the Nile Valley. But first there remained a little more work. The sacred geese still needed his attention. And so, beneath the warm glow of the setting sun, surrounded by feathers, grain, stone, and silence, he continued moving through the enclosure, guiding another ordinary day gently toward night in the ancient world beside the timeless river. The sun drifted lower toward the western horizon. Its light spread across the Nile Valley in long bands of gold and amber. Stone walls glowed softly. Palm trees cast shadows that stretched across pathways and courtyards. The heat of the day slowly retreated, leaving behind a pleasant warmth that settled gently over the land. The keeper of the sacred geese stood quietly beside the enclosure. Around him, the flock was beginning its evening routine. Some birds wandered slowly toward familiar resting places. Others lingered near the water basins. A few younger geese remained energetic, moving about with curiosity even as darkness approached. The keeper watched them patiently. Even after many years, he found comfort in observing the birds. Their habits rarely changed. Their lives followed rhythms that felt dependable. Morning feeding. Afternoon rest. Evening settling. Nighttime silence. Day after day. Season after season, the patterns continued. A soft breeze arrived from the direction of the river. It carried the scent of wet reeds and cool water. The keeper lifted his face slightly toward it. After the long hours of sunlight, the evening air felt refreshing. Many workers throughout the temple appreciated this same moment each day. The arrival of cooler air often felt like a reward earned through labor. Across the temple grounds, activity gradually slowed. Workers completed final tasks. Storage rooms were secured. Tools were returned to their places. Sweepers made one last pass through courtyards and walkways. The sounds of labor grew less frequent. Soon only a few voices remained. The temple was preparing for night. The keeper walked along the enclosure fence. The ground beneath his sandals remained warm from the day's heat. Here and there, small clouds of dust rose with each step. The geese moved calmly around him. Some appeared almost sleepy. Others tucked their heads briefly beneath their wings before lifting them again. The flock seemed to understand that daylight was ending. Animals often sensed such changes without needing to think about them. The world itself provided the signals. The angle of the sunlight, the cooling air, the lengthening shadows, the gradual fading of daytime sounds. The keeper paused near one of the shelters. Several older geese rested there together. Their feathers glowed softly beneath the golden light. For many years these birds had lived within the temple grounds. Some had spent nearly their entire lives here. They knew the enclosure well. They knew its shaded corners, its water basins, its feeding areas. The rhythms of temple life had become their rhythms as well. The keeper checked the shelter carefully. Everything appeared secure. A few reeds needed adjustment. He made the repairs immediately. The work took only a few moments. Small tasks completed promptly often prevented larger problems later. That lesson applied to many aspects of life. As he finished, the sky continued changing above him. Orange deepened into rich shades of copper and red. The western horizon glowed brightly. High overhead, the blue sky slowly darkened. The transition from day to night always felt peaceful within the temple. There was no sudden ending. No sharp divide. Light simply softened little by little. The keeper walked toward a nearby courtyard. From there he could see part of the Nile beyond the temple walls. The river reflected the colors of sunset. Bands of gold shimmered across the surface. A few boats moved quietly through the evening light. Their silhouettes appeared dark against the glowing water. The keeper watched them for a moment. Some boats carried fishermen returning home. Others transported goods between settlements. The river remained busy even near sunset. Its waters connected countless lives. Farmers, merchants, temple workers, builders, families. Everyone depended upon the Nile in one way or another. The keeper felt a quiet appreciation whenever he looked upon the river. Not because he thought of it as remarkable, but because it had always been there. Like the sunrise, like the changing seasons, like the temple itself. Some things became so familiar that people rarely stopped to consider their importance. Yet without them, life would be entirely different. The sounds of birds returning to roost echoed from nearby trees. Small flocks crossed the darkening sky. The keeper listened carefully. Evening possessed its own collection of sounds. Different from morning. Different from midday. Gentler somehow. The world seemed to lower its voice. The geese had grown quieter too. Many now rested near the shelters. Others stood peacefully beside one another. Only occasional calls disturbed the calm. The keeper made another slow circuit around the enclosure. This final inspection had become almost ceremonial through repetition. Every evening followed the same pattern. Check the gates. Examine the fencing. Observe the birds. Confirm the water supply. Ensure that everything remains secure. Then prepare to leave. The routine never varied much. Perhaps that was one reason he found it comforting. There was reassurance in knowing exactly what needed to be done. The day's responsibilities unfolded in a familiar order. The completion of those responsibilities brought a sense of peace. As darkness approached, temple lamps began to appear. Small points of warm light flickered beside doorways and along pathways. Workers lit them one by one. The flames reflected softly against stone surfaces. Shadows danced along walls carved with ancient images. The temple took on a different character at night. Less imposing. More intimate. The keeper always enjoyed this transformation. The great stone structures seemed gentler beneath lamplight. The air itself felt calmer. Nearby, a young worker carried an oil lamp through a corridor. The flame swayed slightly as he walked. For a moment, the light illuminated painted scenes on the wall. Then both worker and lamp disappeared into shadow. The keeper continued watching the geese. The birds were nearly settled now. Many stood quietly in groups. Others had already begun sleeping. The enclosure felt peaceful. The kind of peace that arrives naturally after a long day. Not silence exactly, but something close. A few soft sounds remained. The rustle of feathers. The occasional movement of water. The whisper of wind through reeds. The keeper stood beside the gate and rested his hands upon the wooden frame. His body felt pleasantly tired. The weight of the day's labor lingered in his muscles. His feet ached slightly. His shoulders felt heavy. These sensations had accompanied countless evenings. They were familiar companions. Signs that work had been completed. Signs that rest was approaching. The western horizon grew dimmer. The last traces of sunlight began to fade. Stars appeared one by one overhead. At first only a few. Then many more. Soon the entire sky would glitter above the Nile Valley. The keeper had watched this transformation thousands of times. Yet it never seemed repetitive. Each evening carried its own quiet beauty. The geese settled deeper into stillness. The temple grew quieter. The day slowly released its hold upon the land. And there, beside the enclosure, surrounded by cooling air and fading light, the keeper remained for a little while longer, allowing himself to enjoy the peaceful moments between work and home while ancient Egypt drifted gently toward another calm and star-filled night. The last glow of sunset slowly disappeared beyond the western horizon. Darkness settled across the Nile Valley with a gentle patience that seemed to belong to the ancient world itself. The bright colors of evening faded into soft shades of blue and gray. Above, the stars grew sharper and more numerous with every passing moment. The keeper of the sacred geese remained beside the enclosure gate. For a little while longer, there was no need to leave. The flock was calm. The temple was quiet. The night air felt cool against his skin. After the long heat of the day, these moments carried a special kind of comfort. Around him, the sacred geese had nearly all settled into sleep. Some rested with their heads tucked beneath their wings. Others stood quietly in small groups. A few shifted occasionally, rustling their feathers before becoming still once more. The sounds within the enclosure had become soft and infrequent. A gentle movement. A faint splash of water. The quiet murmur of sleeping birds. Nothing more. The keeper listened. Over many years he had learned the difference between peaceful sounds and troubling ones. Tonight everything sounded exactly as it should. The flock rested safely. Beyond the enclosure, the temple continued its slow transition into night. Oil lamps flickered in distant corridors. Their warm light glowed against stone walls covered with painted scenes and carved figures. The flames moved gently whenever a breeze passed through the open spaces. Shadows shifted across columns and courtyards. The great temple seemed almost dreamlike beneath the starlight. Many workers had already departed. The pathways that had been busy during the day now stood nearly empty. Only a few figures moved through the darkness. Night guards. Late working attendants. Priests carrying out quiet responsibilities. The temple never became completely still. Yet compared to the bustling hours of daylight, it felt remarkably peaceful. The keeper began walking slowly around the enclosure one final time. The ground felt cooler beneath his sandals now. The air carried faint scents from the nearby river. Water. Mud. Growing reeds. These familiar smells drifted through the darkness and blended with the scent of stone and dust. As he walked, the stars reflected faintly in the water basins. Tiny points of light shimmered across the surface. A breeze touched the water and the reflections broke apart into gentle ripples. The keeper paused to watch. Simple sights often held his attention. Perhaps because his life moved at a slower rhythm than many people imagine. Without constant noise. Without constant distraction. There was time to notice small things. The movement of water. The changing sky. The habits of birds. The scent of evening air. These details formed the texture of daily life. Far beyond the temple walls, the villages along the Nile were settling into sleep. Families gathered for their final conversations of the evening. Children grew quiet. Cooking fires burned lower. Doors closed against the night. The entire valley seemed to relax after another day of labor. The keeper often imagined similar scenes unfolding across the countryside. Farmers resting after work in the fields. Fishermen returning from the river. Merchants counting the day's earnings before sleep. Countless ordinary people ending ordinary days. Their lives differed from his in many ways. Yet they shared the same rhythms. The same sunrise. The same sunset. The same stars. The same dependence upon the Nile. Eventually the keeper reached the far side of the enclosure. From here he could see beyond part of the temple wall. The moon had climbed higher into the sky. Its pale light spread across the landscape. Fields shimmered faintly in the distance. Palm trees appeared as dark silhouettes against the silver glow. The world seemed calm and endless. He stood quietly for several moments. The silence felt comforting. Not empty. Simply peaceful. Ancient Egypt was often a busy place. Markets filled with voices. Workshops echoed with tools. Boats moved along crowded stretches of river. Laborers hauled stone beneath the sun. Yet there were also moments like this. Moments of stillness. Moments when the world seemed content simply to exist. The keeper appreciated such moments more as he grew older. Years of work had taught him that peace could often be found in simple places. Beside a water basin. Beneath a tree. Along a quiet road. Near a sleeping flock of geese. The night deepened. More stars appeared overhead. Familiar constellations stretched across the heavens. The keeper knew many of them by sight. He had watched them rise and set throughout his life. During childhood. During youth. During the long years of labor that followed. The stars changed position with the seasons. Yet they always returned. Reliable. Predictable. Comforting. In many ways they resembled the routines that shaped his own days. Nearby, one of the geese shifted in its sleep. Feathers rustled softly. Then silence returned. The keeper smiled faintly. Tomorrow morning, before sunrise, these same birds would awaken. They would gather near the feeding areas. They would call impatiently while he prepared grain. They would drink fresh water and wander through the enclosure. The cycle would begin again. He found comfort in that certainty. Life could be difficult. Harvests sometimes failed. Illness sometimes arrived unexpectedly. Floods varied from year to year. Yet some things remained dependable. Tomorrow's work awaited. The geese would need care. The temple would open its gates. The sun would rise above the eastern horizon. These truths required no prediction. They simply belonged to the natural order of things. At last, the keeper approached the enclosure gate once more. His final inspection was complete. Everything appeared secure. The birds were resting peacefully. The fences remained strong. The water basins were full. The day's responsibilities had ended. He rested one hand upon the wooden gate. For a brief moment he looked back across the sleeping flock. Moonlight touched the white feathers of several birds. They appeared almost luminous against the darkness. The sight was beautiful in a quiet and ordinary way. Not the kind of beauty celebrated in songs or monuments. A gentler beauty. The beauty of a task completed well. The beauty of peaceful animals resting safely. The beauty of another day brought successfully to its close. The keeper turned away and began walking toward the temple exit. His footsteps echoed softly across the stone pathway. Behind him, the enclosure remained silent beneath the stars. Ahead lay the familiar road home. Beyond that waited a simple meal, a sleeping mat, and a few precious hours of rest before dawn returned once more. And so, beneath a sky filled with ancient stars, while the Nile flowed steadily through the darkness and the sacred geese slept quietly within their enclosure, the keeper made his way through the peaceful temple grounds, carrying with him the calm satisfaction of another ordinary day completed beside the timeless river. The keeper left the temple behind him and stepped onto the familiar road that led toward the village. The night had fully settled across the Nile Valley now. The stars stretched from one horizon to the other. The moon hung above the fields, casting a pale silver glow across the land. The air felt cool and pleasant after the long warmth of the day. Each breath seemed easier. Each step felt lighter. The temple walls gradually disappeared behind him. Their massive stone shapes blended into the darkness. Only a few distant lamps remained visible, flickering softly like small stars resting upon the earth. The keeper walked at an unhurried pace. There was no need to rush home. The day's work had been completed. Tomorrow's work belonged to tomorrow. For now, the road itself offered a quiet kind of peace. Dust softened the sound of his footsteps. Palm trees stood along portions of the path. Their leaves whispered whenever a breeze moved through them. The sounds of the village floated faintly through the night. A distant voice. A barking dog. The creak of a wooden door. Life had not completely fallen asleep yet. Many families remained awake. Evening often provided the only hours when ordinary people could truly rest together. During daylight, labor filled most moments. The fields demanded attention. The workshops required effort. The temple called for duty. But night belonged to quieter things. Meals. Conversations. Stories. Moments shared beneath the stars. The keeper passed a small irrigation channel running beside the road. Moonlight reflected from the water. Tiny ripples moved across the surface. The water flowed slowly toward nearby fields. Even at night, the systems that supported life continued their work. The Nile fed the canals. The canals nourished the crops. The crops sustained the people. The people cared for the temples and animals. Everything remained connected. The keeper often understood this without needing to think about it directly. It was simply part of life. A truth visible everywhere. As he continued walking, he noticed movement among the fields. Several farmers were checking irrigation gates before sleep. Their work sometimes extended into the evening, especially during important periods of the growing season. The men carried small lamps. Their lights moved slowly through the darkness. The keeper raised a hand in greeting. One of the farmers returned the gesture. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. People who worked long hours often understood each other without conversation. They shared the same tired muscles. The same dusty sandals. The same appreciation for a cool evening breeze. The road curved gently toward the village. Ahead, clusters of mudbrick homes appeared beneath moonlight. Their flat roofs reflected pale silver light. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward into the night sky. The smell of bread lingered in the air. The keeper always noticed that scent. Bread formed the foundation of daily life. Every household baked it. Every worker depended upon it. The smell carried memories. Morning meals. Evening meals. Days that seemed ordinary at the time but later blended together into years. As he approached the village, the sounds became clearer. Families sat outside their homes enjoying the cooler air. Children whispered sleepily beside their parents. Older people spoke in calm voices about crops, weather, and daily concerns. The conversations drifted through the darkness like gentle currents. No one seemed in a hurry. Night encouraged slowness. The keeper passed several neighbors. They exchanged brief greetings. A nod. A quiet word. A simple smile. Many of these people had known him for years. Some had watched him make the same journey between temple and village almost every day. Others worked in nearby fields or workshops. Their lives followed different paths, yet their routines often overlapped. Everyone belonged to the same small community shaped by the river. The keeper reached his home. The doorway glowed faintly from the light of an oil lamp inside. The sight brought immediate comfort. After hours spent among stone walls and open courtyards, the small house felt welcoming. Familiar. Safe. He stepped inside. The room smelled of bread, warm clay, and smoke from a cooking fire. Simple possessions occupied familiar places. Woven baskets. Clay jars. Reed mats. A low wooden stool. Nothing had changed since morning. Yet after a long day away, everything seemed comforting. The keeper sat down carefully. His body welcomed the rest. The ache in his legs became more noticeable now. His shoulders felt heavy. His hands were rough from years of work. These signs of labor had become permanent companions. He hardly thought about them anymore. Nearby, a meal waited. Simple food. Fresh bread. Beans. Perhaps onions or greens gathered from a garden. Maybe a small portion of fish from the river. Nothing extravagant. Yet after a day spent working beneath the sun, such meals felt deeply satisfying. The keeper ate slowly. Outside, the village continued settling into quiet. Voices gradually faded. One by one, lamps were extinguished. Darkness spread gently across the settlement. The sounds of nighttime insects grew more noticeable. The world seemed to soften. As he ate, the keeper thought briefly about the geese. Not with worry. The enclosure was secure. The birds were safe. Their routines would continue through the night without him. Yet years of responsibility created habits of thought. A person who cared for animals often carried them in the back of his mind. He remembered individual birds, their habits, their preferred resting places, their small differences. The flock had become a familiar presence in his life. Much as neighbors became familiar, much as fields became familiar. The meal finished, the keeper stepped outside once more. The village was nearly asleep now. Moonlight covered the rooftops. The stars seemed brighter than before. The air felt wonderfully cool. He stood quietly and looked toward the distant river. Though hidden by darkness and distance, he could still sense its presence. The Nile flowed steadily beyond the fields. Its waters moved through the night exactly as they had during the day. The river never seemed to sleep. Perhaps that was one reason it felt eternal. Generations came and went. The river continued. Children grew old. The river continued. Temples rose. Temples weathered. The river continued. The keeper listened carefully. From far away came the faint sound of water moving against reeds. The sound was barely audible. Yet it felt comforting. Like hearing the voice of an old friend. A breeze passed through the village. Palm leaves rustled overhead. The keeper closed his eyes briefly. The cool air felt pleasant against his skin. For a few moments he simply stood there. No responsibilities. No tasks. No schedules. Only the night. Only the stars. Only the quiet world resting beside the Nile. Eventually he returned indoors. The oil lamp burned lower now. Its flame flickered gently. The room glowed with warm amber light. The keeper prepared his sleeping mat. The familiar routine unfolded slowly. Sandals set aside. Lamp adjusted. Mat arranged. The small actions required little thought. He had performed them thousands of times. Outside, the village had become almost completely silent. The last conversations had ended. The last doors had closed. Sleep was settling across the settlement. The keeper lowered himself onto the mat. His muscles relaxed. The weariness of the day spread through his body. Yet it was not an unpleasant feeling. It carried the satisfaction of work completed. The certainty of routine fulfilled. The comfort of knowing that tomorrow would arrive much like today had. The temple would awaken. The geese would gather near the feeding grounds. The sun would rise over the eastern horizon. And once again, he would walk the familiar road toward another quiet day among the sacred birds. For now, however, the ancient world rested beneath moonlight. The village slept. The temple stood silent. The geese dreamed quietly within their enclosure. And the keeper allowed himself to drift toward sleep while the timeless waters of the Nile flowed gently through the darkness beyond. Deep in the quiet hours before dawn, the Nile Valley rested beneath a sky filled with stars. The village was silent. The temple stood motionless beside the river. Fields stretched into darkness, their outlines softened by moonlight and shadow. Even the breeze seemed to move gently, as though careful not to disturb the sleeping world. Inside his small mud-brick home, the keeper of the sacred geese slept peacefully upon his reed mat. The long day had left him tired. His muscles rested after hours of walking, lifting, carrying, and tending to the flock. The familiar aches of labor had softened during the night. Outside, the stars continued their slow journey across the heavens. Hours passed quietly. Then, little by little, the darkness began to change. It happened so gradually that no single moment marked the transition. The deepest black of night softened into dark blue. The eastern horizon became slightly less shadowed. The stars nearest the earth began to fade. A new day was approaching. The keeper stirred. His eyes opened slowly. For a moment he remained still, listening. The village had not yet awakened. Only the faint sounds of insects and distant water disturbed the silence. The air felt cool. Perhaps cooler than it had been all week. He sat up carefully. The room around him remained dim. A faint glow from the fading moon entered through a small opening in the wall. Everything looked familiar. The clay jars. The woven baskets. The simple sleeping mat. The keeper rose quietly. Years of routine had made these early mornings feel natural. There was no struggle against sleep. No hesitation. His body understood the rhythm. Wake before dawn. Walk to the temple. Feed the geese. Begin again. Outside, the village remained wrapped in stillness. A few lamps glowed faintly inside distant homes. Some workers would already be awake. Bakers. Farmers. Water carriers. Temple servants. The earliest laborers often began their days while most people still slept. The keeper stepped onto the road. Dust crunched softly beneath his sandals. The cool air felt pleasant against his skin. Above him, the stars still shone brightly. The moon hung low now, preparing to disappear beyond the horizon. The road toward the temple stretched ahead through shadow and silver light. The keeper knew every bend. Every patch of uneven ground. Every cluster of palm trees. Years of walking had turned the journey into second nature. As he moved through the darkness, the scent of damp earth drifted from nearby fields. The Nile had left its mark upon the land once again. Moisture lingered in irrigation channels. Plants gathered strength from the rich soil. Life along the river depended upon such quiet gifts. The keeper passed several fields where grain stood motionless beneath the fading stars. Soon sunlight would touch the stalks. Soon workers would arrive. Soon the day would begin. But for now, the landscape remained calm. The silence felt almost sacred. Ahead, the temple slowly emerged from the darkness. Its great walls rose above the horizon. Massive stone structures appeared gray beneath the fading moonlight. The keeper always found something reassuring in that sight. No matter what happened during a season. No matter how difficult a harvest might be. The temple remained. Its walls greeted each sunrise. Its courtyards welcomed each new day. Its routines continued. The keeper entered through the workers' gate. Several familiar figures had already arrived. A gardener carrying tools. A young assistant balancing empty baskets. An older laborer sweeping dust from a pathway. Quiet greetings passed between them. No one spoke loudly. Morning encouraged calm voices. Inside the temple grounds, the coolness lingered. Stone floors still held traces of the night's freshness. Palm trees cast long shadows beneath the stars. The air smelled faintly of water and stone. The keeper made his way toward the enclosure. Even before reaching it, he heard the geese. Soft calls drifted through the darkness. The flock was waking. The sounds grew clearer with each step. Rustling feathers. Gentle movements. The low murmur of birds beginning another day. The keeper smiled. The routine felt comforting, familiar, reliable. The geese were always there waiting. When he opened the enclosure gate, several birds immediately approached. Their silhouettes moved through the dim light. A few stretched their wings. Others wandered toward feeding areas. The keeper began his morning inspection. This happened before any grain was distributed. The flock came first. He walked slowly among them, observing, listening, watching. A healthy bird stood differently from an unhealthy one. A healthy bird moved with confidence. Years of experience had sharpened his attention to such details. He noticed everything. The condition of feathers, the steadiness of movement, the alertness in their behavior. This careful observation formed one of the most important parts of his work. As he moved through the enclosure, the eastern horizon brightened slightly. The first hint of dawn appeared. A pale line stretched across the distance. The stars nearest the horizon began disappearing. The world prepared itself for morning. The keeper left briefly and entered the grain storage room. Inside, cool air surrounded him. Clay jars lined the walls. Baskets stood ready. Dust floated through narrow beams of growing light. The smell of grain filled the room. Dry, earthy, comforting. He filled several baskets. Scoop after scoop. The grain poured softly into woven containers. The sound was familiar, almost soothing. By the time he carried the baskets back outside, dawn had advanced further. The geese immediately noticed. The flock became more active. Calls echoed through the enclosure. Birds gathered near feeding areas. Necks stretched forward expectantly. The keeper scattered grain across the ground. The birds moved toward it eagerly. Feathers brushed together. Feet shuffled through dust. The enclosure filled with gentle activity. The feeding had begun. As the geese ate, sunlight touched the highest temple walls. The first golden rays appeared above the horizon. Stone columns glowed softly. Painted carvings emerged from shadow. The temple awakened beneath the rising sun. Workers across the complex resumed their duties. Sweepers crossed courtyards. Gardeners carried water. Priests prepared for rituals. The quiet stillness of night gradually gave way to the steady rhythm of day. The keeper watched the flock. The birds ate peacefully. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared healthy. Another day had begun exactly as expected. And in a world shaped by seasons, labor, and routine, such predictability felt deeply reassuring. The sun climbed a little higher. Golden light spread across the enclosure. The coolness of dawn lingered for a few precious moments longer. Soon the heat would return. Soon shadows would shorten. Soon another cycle of work would unfold beneath the Egyptian sky. But for now, in the gentle light of early morning, surrounded by grain, water, feathers, and birdsong, the keeper continued his quiet responsibilities among the sacred temple geese, while the ancient world slowly awakened beside the eternal waters of the Nile. The early morning light spread steadily across the temple grounds. What had been shadow only a short while ago now glowed with soft gold. Stone walls reflected the first warmth of the sun. Palm trees cast long graceful shadows across courtyards. The coolness of dawn lingered in sheltered places, though everyone knew it would not last. The keeper of the sacred geese stood quietly near the enclosure as the flock finished its morning meal. Around him, the birds moved with calm purpose. Some searched the ground for remaining grains. Others walked toward the water basins. Several younger geese wandered together in small groups, exploring familiar corners as though they were discovering them for the first time. The keeper watched them with practiced eyes. Years of experience had taught him to notice countless small details. A slight change in behavior. A bird separating itself from the flock. An unusual movement. Most mornings revealed nothing concerning. Most mornings unfolded exactly as expected. That consistency brought comfort. Life beside the Nile depended upon reliable rhythms. The flooding of the river. The growth of crops. The rising and setting of the sun. The routines of animals. The work of ordinary people. Each depended upon patterns repeating themselves. As the birds settled after feeding, the keeper turned his attention to the water basins. Fresh water remained essential. The morning air still felt pleasant enough that the birds moved freely around the enclosure, but later, as temperatures rose, water would become even more important. He lifted a clay jar and poured fresh water into one basin. The surface rippled gently. Several geese approached almost immediately. The keeper paused to watch. Morning sunlight sparkled across the water. Tiny reflections danced among the ripples. The scene felt peaceful. Simple. The kind of moment that could easily pass unnoticed. Yet such moments filled much of his life. And perhaps that was why his days often felt calm despite the constant labor. There was beauty in ordinary things when one spent enough time observing them. Nearby, the temple itself continued awakening. More workers arrived through the gates. Voices drifted across open courtyards. Tools clinked softly. Wooden doors opened and closed. A gardener pushed a cart loaded with baskets. A young assistant hurried across a pathway carrying supplies. The sounds blended together into the familiar music of a working temple. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. Only the steady pulse of daily life. The keeper walked slowly around the enclosure. The ground beneath his sandals remained cool in shaded areas. Dust rose lightly where sunlight had already warmed the earth. The flock seemed content. Birds moved comfortably between water, shade, and open ground. Everything appeared as it should. Beyond the enclosure walls, the Nile flowed quietly through the landscape. Though the river could not always be seen from every part of the temple, its influence was everywhere. The grain stored in temple granaries. The vegetables growing in nearby gardens. The reeds used for repairs. The water carried in clay jars. All of it traced back to the river. Without the Nile, the temple could not function. Without the Nile, there would be no sacred geese to feed. The keeper often sensed this connection even when he was not consciously thinking about it. The river was simply part of life. As natural as breathing. As dependable as sunrise. The sun climbed higher. Its warmth spread steadily across the enclosure. The birds responded gradually. Several geese moved toward shaded shelters. Others lingered beside the water. The keeper knew these patterns well. Morning always followed a predictable course. The first hours brought energy and movement. Later came rest and shade. Then afternoon quiet. Then evening activity once more. The flock lived according to rhythms as old as the land itself. A soft breeze drifted through the temple grounds. Palm leaves rustled overhead. For a few moments, the air carried the scent of flowering plants from one of the temple gardens. The fragrance mixed with the smell of earth, water, grain, and dust. The keeper breathed deeply. The scent reminded him that not all labor involved stone and sunlight. Gardeners worked tirelessly to maintain beauty within the temple. Just as he cared for the geese. Just as farmers cared for crops. Every worker contributed something different. Together they sustained the larger whole. The keeper approached a section of fencing near the northern edge of the enclosure. One of the support posts leaned slightly. Nothing serious, but worth correcting. He fetched rope and tools from a nearby storage area. The repair took time. He tightened bindings, adjusted the post, checked its stability, then checked again. Patience mattered more than speed. A hurried repair often created future problems. The keeper preferred doing things properly, even when nobody noticed. Especially when nobody noticed. Many of the most important tasks were invisible when done well. The geese certainly paid little attention to the repaired post. They continued their routines without concern. And that was perfectly fine. The keeper never expected gratitude from the birds. Their health and safety served as their own reward. The morning advanced. The sun rose higher. The shadows shortened. Workers across the temple became busier. Several carts arrived carrying supplies. A group of laborers crossed a nearby courtyard transporting baskets of grain. The keeper watched them briefly. Their work looked heavy, yet familiar. Almost every job in Egypt required physical effort. People carried, lifted, pulled, dug, built, walked. The entire civilization rested upon countless hours of ordinary labor. The great monuments often remembered kings. But daily life depended upon workers. The keeper knew this truth not through books or records. He knew it through experience. The temple required care every day. Not occasionally. Not only during ceremonies. Every single day. The geese needed feeding whether visitors arrived or not. Water needed carrying whether celebrations occurred or not. Routine sustained everything. By mid-morning, the coolness of dawn had completely disappeared. The air grew warmer. The sunlight brightened. Several geese settled beneath shelters. Others stood quietly in patches of shade. The keeper himself felt the heat beginning to build. Sweat formed along his brow. His linen clothing clung slightly to his skin. Soon the hottest part of the day would arrive. For now, however, there was still work to do. He inspected another section of the enclosure. He checked water levels again. He removed scattered debris. One task flowed naturally into the next. The rhythm felt familiar. Comfortable. Predictable. As the morning continued, a small group of wild birds landed briefly on a nearby wall. The sacred geese noticed immediately. Several lifted their heads. A few called softly. The visitors remained only a short while before taking flight once more. The keeper watched them disappear into the sky. Their freedom contrasted with the protected life of the temple flock. Yet both belonged to the same landscape. The same river. The same endless cycle of days and seasons. The sun climbed steadily upward. The temple buzzed gently with activity. The geese rested and wandered. The keeper moved among them with patient attention. Another ordinary morning unfolded exactly as countless mornings had before it. No great events occurred. No famous figures appeared. Only the quiet work of feeding, cleaning, repairing, observing, and caring. Yet in that simplicity lay the true rhythm of life beside the Nile. And so the keeper continued through the growing warmth of the day, surrounded by birds, stone, sunlight, and the endless routines that connected one sunrise to the next in the ancient world. And now, as our long journey through the ancient world begins to fade into the quiet darkness, the Nile continues its endless flow beneath the stars. The temple stands silent beside the river. Its stone walls rest beneath moonlight. Its courtyards have emptied. Its lamps burn low. The sounds of the day have disappeared into memory. The sacred geese sleep peacefully within their enclosure. Their feathers rise and fall with slow breaths. The water in their basins reflects the stars overhead. Nothing disturbs the calm. Nothing asks for attention. Nothing remains to be done until morning. The keeper of the geese rests as well. In his small mud-brick home, beyond the temple walls, he sleeps upon his reed mat. The day's work is finished. The grain has been scattered. The water has been refreshed. The gates have been secured. The birds are safe. His tired hands are still. His weary feet no longer walk dusty roads. For a few quiet hours, both keeper and flock share the same gift: rest. Outside, the villages along the Nile have grown silent. Cooking fires have faded. Conversations have ended. Doors have closed. Families sleep beneath flat rooftops cooled by the night air. The fields rest beneath silver moonlight. Palm trees sway gently in the darkness. The scent of river water drifts across the land. Far away, reeds whisper softly along the riverbank. The Nile moves steadily onward. Just as it did yesterday. Just as it will tomorrow. The stars continue their slow journey overhead. The same stars watched the keeper. The same stars watched the geese. The same stars watched generations of workers, farmers, fishermen, builders, servants, and families whose names have long since faded from memory. Their days were simple. Their lives were filled with routine. Their stories rarely appeared in great records. Yet they lived beneath this same sky. They walked these same roads. They listened to these same evening breezes. And night after night, they drifted into sleep beside the timeless river. The temple grows quieter still. The birds dream. The keeper sleeps. The river flows. The stars shine. And the ancient world slowly fades into darkness. The warm desert wind softens. The sounds become distant. The stone walls disappear into shadow. The moonlight rests gently upon the Nile. Everything grows calm. Everything grows quiet. Everything grows still. And there, beside the peaceful river of ancient Egypt, beneath a sky full of silent stars, history finally drifts away into sleep.